Hello everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Ireland is really awesome. I love it. My name is Looney, and today I'm going to take you on a little tour of Django's authentication system. So how many of you use Django somewhat regularly? Okay, cool. Well, hopefully you get something out of this. So during this talk, I'll be covering the authentication models that Django provides, as well as the login, logout, and signup features. And then I'll talk about how to customize, manage, and organize your users by using Django's built-in user model. And then I'll talk about giving users permissions and talk about the built-in Django admin panel. So let's get started. So what is Django's authentication system? It seems kind of like one of those magical things, but it's really just an app that Django sets up automatically for you when you start your project with the Django admin start project command. So Django has left us some basic tools in there for us to have a basic authentication system for our project. It sets up a system for managing users, including a database table where it sets up all the appropriate database relationships and all that for you. It also provides password storage and password handling automatically. And it sets up the Django admin, which provides forms and a full UI for managing users and other models. It also handles things like cookie-based user sessions and authorizations and all that fancy stuff. So Django's authentication app sounds really great. But how does it work? In order for us to get the most out of this great feature, I think it's important that we know a bit about how it works in the background. So we can also find out a bit about how it can be customized to better suit our app. So Django's authentication app contains a few models, which are really kind of the core of how it works. So these are user, group, and permissions. So I'll start by running through these, beginning with user. So the user model is really kind of the core of Django's authentication system models. So Django has equipped our user with a lot of the basic attributes like username, password, email, first name, last name, where username is the primary key. Creating users is pretty simple. So users are created much like other models in Django are created. So here we are just creating a user with a username, an email, and a password. Django also has a simple way of authenticating users. It has a built-in function that will allow us to authenticate users based on the values that we pass it. So here, we're just passing a username and password. It does everything for us. But we don't have to worry too much about creating authentication views ourselves, since Django has provided us with some shortcuts as part of its authentication app. It gives us tools for setting up sign-up page, login, logout, and password reset. So first we'll talk about signup. For this, Django has provided us with a signup form called the user creation form, which is a model form for the user model. It has 3 fields that the user will fill out, which are username, password 1, and password 2. Password 1 and password 2 are checked for equality with the built-in function validate password. If they match and the form is valid, then the user's password is set with the built-in set password function. From here, we can just set up a simple view to handle this form. But there's always the question of what if we want more than just these 3 fields for our wonderful form? Well, we can easily do that by creating a new form that inherits the user creation form that Django has created for us. So here we can add some new fields while retaining all of the great background features that Django has provided us. So next, we'll talk about login. And for this, Django has actually provided us with a view that we can use to handle all the authentication for us. But we have to do a few things on our end to get it all set up. So the first thing that we'll need to do is to create a URL for Django's login view. So all we do is set up a normal URL and then just point it to Django's login view that we've imported. We'll also need to set up a template for this view. So by default, Django assumes that our template will be under the registration/login.html location, which is great. But we can also override this by passing our new template name as a parameter in the URL declaration. So we just set the template name variable to whatever we want it to be. Either way, we just need to make sure that we set up a template for our login view. So we can set up this page however you want, style it however you want, make it look really pretty. But the main thing is that we just need to make sure we include that form that will be used for logging in. And by default, this will just have the username and password fields. So next is logout. And so logout is implemented very similarly from login in that it's just a view that Django has provided us. Again, we'll need to set up a URL for this logout view. But one thing to note here is that instead of specifying a template, we can instead specify the next page attribute. And so this is where we want our users to be redirected after logout. So instead of creating a special template for the logout page, we can just have them be redirected somewhere else, like the home page. So now on to password reset. This one is a little bit more complicated and actually has 4 views that we'll need to use. The password reset view provides a page where the user can make the request to have a password reset by submitting their email address. The password reset done view happens after the user submits the password reset request. And so here they will be given instructions on how they need to check their email and click the link and all that sort of stuff. And so the password reset confirm view will validate the token that the user sent in the email. And the password reset complete view is for when the user has successfully changed their password and just gives them a nice kind of success message and leads them on somewhere else. As with all of the others, we need to set up URLs for these 4 views. So we could do just as we did before and list them all out, all nice, each individual one. But for the sake of simplicity and because it's hard to fit on one slide, we can also include all of Django's auth views in our URLs. And so this is kind of a convenient way to do things if you don't need to add additional parameters to each of the URLs like we did with the login page. So on to our next thing, the templates. So this requires templates as well. And this seems a little daunting, but most of these templates are pretty straightforward. For 2 of them, the reset form and the confirm page, all we have to do is include a form, just like we did with the login.html page. And so this is just for the initial password reset request and the confirmation of the token. For the others, it's just a matter of creating an informative message or a success message. And the only one that is a little different is the email template, where we have to make sure that we provide a link with the reset token. In the email template, we need to make sure that we set up a link that contains these 3 attributes, which are the password reset confirmation page, the UID, and the token that will identify the user. So this is what will allow the user to be authenticated when they click the link. And because we need to send emails, we also need to make sure that we set up the email backend that we want Django to use. So this is done in your settings.py file. And up here, this is just the default Django email backend, which is usually just used for development. So you'll need to set it to whatever you'll need. So now that we've covered a bit how to use Django's authentication views, let's talk a bit about how we can handle users in our own views, on our own pages. So the first thing that seems kind of obvious is checking to see if a user is even logged in. So Django provides us with a mix-in for our views that allows us to check if a user is logged in. So if they aren't logged in, they won't be given access to the page, or they could be redirected somewhere. And if you're into function-based views, Django also provides us with a decorator that works just the same way. So now that we've talked a bit about authenticating users and how Django even has some built-in things that use this functionality, I think it would be kind of interesting to see how this kind of works in the background and kind of what's going on behind the scenes a little bit. So I've talked about the authenticate method, and so the way that works is it communicates with Django's default authentication backend, providing it credentials that we provide as arguments, so the username and password. From there, the authentication backend will use those credentials to look up a user from the user table in the database, the same one that Django has set up for us automatically. So if a user is found, then that user object is returned, and if one isn't found, then it returns permission denied. But what is this authentication backend? It's really just a class that has two methods, getUser and authenticate. By default, Django provides us one that checks the user table, like the previous slide mentioned. But this one is pretty basic and doesn't provide any protection against brute force attacks or anything like that. But fortunately, it's really easy to create our own custom authentication backend. All we would need to do is create a new class that has those two functions I mentioned, authenticate and getUser. So from here, we can customize however we want our users to be authenticated and even put in some additional security measures as we see fit. So we can, from doing it this way, we can also change how we have users log in, so we could have them log in with a token instead of username and password, that sort of thing. So now that we know how to set up and log in our users and even help them reset our password, how do we go about identifying our users? How can we manage our users? Well, one great way for us to manage users is by using an interface that Django gives us right out of the box, which is the Django admin. So by default, Django sets up the auth models in the Django admin for us. So from here, we can manage our users and groups and all that. And these forms are based on the database tables that Django has set up for us for the user and group models. So this gives us a nice interface where we can search for users and make changes to their attributes and all that sort of nice stuff. But although this is nice, we also definitely want to be able to identify our users throughout the back end of our app. So first, let's talk about views. I mentioned before how we can easily check to see if a user is logged in. But now let's go over how we can actually manage a user from a view. So from a view, a user can be accessed from the request.user object. So this will return a user object if the user is logged in, or an anonymous user if they aren't. You can also check if a user is logged in by checking the isAuthenticated attribute. From here, you can access any of the attributes of the user model and even manage your user however you need to. So you can also grab the user's user object and do whatever you want to it, like update it, change the attributes, or even delete it. The logic at the template layer is very similar. When a Django template is rendered, the user is automatically stored in the user template variable. From here, things work pretty much the same way. So we can still use the isAuthenticated function, and we can still access all of the user's attributes. But wait, you might be saying, Django's idea of a user model is different from mine. I don't want my user to look like this. That's boring. I want my user to look like this. Well, luckily, Django has left us some ways to customize the user model. There are quite a few ways to do this, but I'll talk about two of the most common ways, which I think are usually very useful. These are extending the user model and replacing the user model with a custom one. So one of these is very easy to do, the other is slightly less easy to do, but both are great ways to customize the user model. So first, let's talk about extending the user model. What does that mean exactly? It means that we will keep Django's user model just how it is, except we'll give it a bucket where we can store additional attributes. So this option is really just good for when we want to add extra attributes to our user, since we're not actually changing the user model itself, we're just adding to it. But usually this is the only thing that we often need to do. So let's take a look at how this would be set up. We start by creating a regular new model. This will be our bucket where we hold the additional attributes. Then we need to create a field called user, which will have a one-to-one relationship with Django's user model. This means that all of our user detail objects will have one user, and all of our users will have one user detail object. So each bucket has one user, and every user just has one bucket. From here, we can add all of the attributes that we want for our user model. So this is where we're essentially turning it into our great bucket. There are a few things we need to keep in mind when doing this, though. Because we need every user to have a user detail object, we need to make sure that when a user is created, a user detail object is also created. And of course, if a user is deleted, we need to make sure that their user detail object is also deleted. So extending the user model is really good when we want to add additional attributes to our user model. But what if we want a totally different user model? What if instead of this or this, we wanted something like this? This is where our second option comes in, which is to replace the user model with our own custom user model. So doing it this way is going to be a little bit more complicated, but it allows us a lot more freedom with customization. It's especially good for if you want to use a different required field from username. So often we might want users to log in with their email address instead of their username. The only way to do that is if we use a different user model. So let's talk about how this might be implemented. We could, of course, just start from the ground up, start from scratch, and just build up our own user model piece by piece. But fortunately, Django has provided us with some tools that will give us some shortcuts here. This is where the abstract base user class comes in. So we can inherit from Django's abstract base user model, which will provide us with a base implementation and password handling and all that nice stuff that we don't always necessarily want to deal with ourselves. So all we have to do is fill in the missing parts. So here is our basic setup for a custom user model. All we need to do is inherit from the abstract base user class, and we can start setting up our model's attributes. And so one of the things that it expects us to provide is this username field, which is the unique identifier for this model. And so by default, this will be the username, but since we want our users to log in with email, and we will change that to be email instead. We also need to let Django know that we overrode its user model in settings.py. So to do this, we only need to set a single attribute in settings.py, the auth user model attribute, to our custom user model. So although the abstract base user sets up a lot of nice things for us, it does leave a few things for us to set up ourselves. So mostly these things include setting up a user manager in models.py, which will allow us to define functions of how users are created. And we'll also need to set up a form to edit our custom user model in the Django admin. So this might sound kind of daunting, but fortunately Django has all of these things spelled out in its documentation, and so you could just copy and paste or customize it however you want. So I do want to leave you with a warning about this. If you want to make your own custom user model, I highly advise that you do this at the beginning of your project and not in the middle of your project. So now that we have our user figured out, let's talk about how we can organize our users. This is where groups come in. So the group model also comes with Django's authentication system, and it gives us a way to categorize our users. This means that we can tell what type of user someone is and see what their role is in our app. How can we best use this, though? Let's take a look at a couple of scenarios. So for our first scenario, let's look at how we can use groups for special access. One of the simplest ways to utilize groups in our app is to use them to grant certain users access to certain parts of our app, depending on what group they're in. So this could be like a premium user or an admin or someone who needs to see parts of your website that others can't. So how does this work? One way to achieve this is to create a mixin to use with our views. So here is our view that is using our group required mixin, and it has a variable called group required, which is a list of the group names that we want to be able to see this view. So anyone not in this view will be denied. And here is the actual mixin. And I realize this is probably hard to read, but keep in mind I'll have my slides available after the presentation. So here essentially all that's happening is first it checks to see if the user has any groups. And if they do, then it makes a list of all of the names of the groups that that user is in. And then it goes through that list and checks to see if any of those groups are one of the permitted groups that we've provided in the view. And if they are in one of those groups, then they have permission. Otherwise, it throws permission denied. Another way we can make use of groups is by using them to create a customized experience for our users. So this can be done at the view level and at the template level. So first off, I just thought I'd mention real quick that it is possible for users to be in multiple groups. And that's relevant when we want to deal with what groups a user is in. So in order for us to simply see what groups a user is in, we can use the request.user object, like when we were accessing the user's regular attributes. So using user.groups.all will return a query set with all of the group objects that a user belongs to. And if we want to check if a user is part of a specific group, we can use their user object to see if the group in question is in their list of groups. To do this, we can just use a simple .filter query. And if anyone has used Django, you'll know that the .filter query is very useful. And so here we just need to specify the username and the group name. So we can also use the .filter function to see a list of users who are in a certain group. So for this, we could just specify the group name and get a list of all the users. So what about templates? You might remember that I mentioned we can access the user from the templates. So you might also be wondering how we can check if a user is in a certain group from the template. Well, there are a few ways of doing this, but one pretty easy way that I've discovered is to use a template tag. So here is an example of a very simple template tag that will do just this. So a group name is passed to it from the template, and then we grab the group from there and return a Boolean for whether the user is in that group after we check if the user is in that group. So then on the template side, we would only need to grab the request user and plug it into our group name, plug our group name into the template tag. So of course, we can also take care of all this logic at the view level based on some of the methods I showed previously. And so this is really just kind of a whatever you prefer sort of thing. But by using these methods, we can see a user's group in order for us to customize how they see our app. But what if we want to get more fine-tuned with how we manage our users? What if instead of focusing on users broadly in groups, we want to think of what actions they are allowed to take in our app instead? This is where permissions come in, which are the third model that Django provides us in the authentication system. With permissions, we can specify which actions we want our user to be able to take. If they're granted a permission, they can take that action and otherwise they can't. These actions are tied very closely with our database models. So by default, Django will add permissions to all of your models for adding, deleting, and editing a model. This happens automatically when you run your migrations, not just for the authentication models, but all of your custom models as well. So you can also create your own custom permissions for a model. So all you need to do is add them to the meta class of your model. And so here, each permission is just a tuple where the first string is the name of the permission and the second string is a description of the permission. And these will also show up in the Django admin when you create them here. So Django has a built-in function for checking permissions as well. So given a user object, we can use the hasPerm function to check if a user has a given permission. This can be used in our views to authorize users for certain actions. Another important thing about permissions is that they can also be assigned at the group level. So this means that all users in that group will automatically be given permissions for that group. So now that we have a good idea on what users, groups, and permissions can do, let's quickly tie them all together. First, let's look at assigning users permissions. There are a few ways to do this. And so the user has this user permissions attribute, and that itself has several functions. So we could use set to provide a list of permissions that we want to set to that user. Another way is to use the add function, where we can just list all the permissions we want to add to that user as arguments. And similarly, we can also remove specific permissions from a user. And of course, we can remove all permissions from a user. Adding permissions to groups can be done just the same way. So these functions are great when we're dealing with permissions in our views, but there is an interface that Django has provided us that will allow us to do these things as well. So earlier I mentioned the Django admin, and so this interface is automatically set up for you and all that great stuff. But it's also a great way to manage the permissions that users and groups have. So from here, we can assign users to groups and permissions to groups and users like before, but with a nice user interface. So from the edit user screen, we can specify what groups that user should be in. We can filter on groups, search for groups, see a whole list of all the groups we have. And the same can be done with permissions. So we can filter on permissions, see our big long list of permissions, and assign them to our user. And this can be done for groups as well. It looks just the same way for groups. So obviously, the Django admin has a lot of nice features. And it's really great that we're just giving it out of the box. So we can even add our own models to the Django admin to manage them in similar ways. But that kind of brings up the question of who should have access to the Django admin. It's important that we keep it as just that, an admin panel for admins. So although it has a nice automatically built interface, it's not something we should allow our regular users to use for managing models in our app. So with all these things combined, we have a nice view of what's possible with Django's Authentication app. So hopefully now you have a nice idea of how you can use it to your advantage. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and thank you very much for having me.